September 1st, 1939. The world awoke, not to birdsong, but to the roar of engines. Over the skies of Poland, hundreds of German bombers appeared, a dark swarm, blotting out the morning sun. Their shadows stretched across fields and towns. And then the bombs began to fall. Railroads shattered, bridges collapsed, cities burned, families fled in terror, clutching children, dragging suitcases that would never see safety. In Warsaw, sirens wailed, buildings shook, glass rained down from the sky. It was the beginning of a new kind of war. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a strategy of speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, designed to crush a nation before it could even breathe. For Poland, this was the first day of the end. For the world, it was the day peace finally died. Within weeks, Poland would be carved apart by two merciless giants, Nazi Germany from the west, the Soviet Union from the east, and Europe, which had prayed war could be avoided, now found itself staring into the abyss. This is the story of the invasion of Poland, the spark that ignited the Second World War, and the day the world changed forever. The summer of 1939 was filled with rumors. In Berlin, Hitler's speeches grew sharper, his demands louder. In Warsaw, soldiers drilled in dusty fields, preparing for a fight they knew might come, but prayed would not. And across Europe, people listened anxiously to their radios, wondering if the fragile peace of 2 decades was about to collapse. On August 23rd, the world was stunned. Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn enemies, announced a pact of friendship. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was presented as a simple non-aggression agreement, but behind closed doors, it concealed a darker truth: the secret division of Eastern Europe. For Poland, it was a death sentence. Trapped between two giants, it now stood alone. In Britain and France, leaders promised support, guaranteeing Poland's independence, but their armies were far away, their will uncertain. Ordinary citizens in London and Paris clung to hope. That war could still be avoided. After all, hadn't appeasement worked before? Hadn't Munich spared Europe from bloodshed? Yet in Germany, the preparations were unmistakable. Troop trains rolled eastward. Tanks rumbled across the countryside. Luftwaffe pilots studied maps of Polish cities. Hitler told his generals that war was inevitable, that only through conquest could Germany achieve living space in the East. In smoky offices, plans for Blitzkrieg were finalized, a strategy to strike hard and fast to crush Poland before help could arrive. Meanwhile, in Poland, fear and defiance mingled. The government called for general mobilization, but hesitated, worried that provoking Germany might trigger the very war they hoped to avoid. Farmers looked at their sons in uniform and whispered silent prayers. In Warsaw, children played in the streets, unaware their city was already marked on German bombing charts. Diplomats raced to negotiate, but their words carried no weight. Hitler had already chosen WAR. On August 31st, German operatives staged a fake attack on a border radio station, blaming Poland. It was the excuse he needed, a final act in the theater of lies. That night, German troops assembled along the frontier. Engines idled, pilots strapped into cockpits. Commanders received sealed envelopes, marked to be opened at dawn. Across Europe, millions went to bed, not knowing that when the sun rose, their world would never be the same. The countdown to invasion was over. The storm was ready to break. At dawn, September 1st, 1939, the countdown ended. The first bombs fell on the Polish town of Wielun, destroying a hospital filled with patients. It was not a military target, but that was the point. Terror was part of the strategy. The age of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun. German Stuka dive bombers screamed out of the sky, sirens attached to their wings howling like demons as they plunged. Buildings exploded into dust. Railroads were ripped apart. Columns of refugees scattered in panic, strafed by machine gun fire from above. To the east, German tanks rolled forward in tight formation. Panzer divisions, supported by motorized infantry, surged across the border at a speed never before seen in modern war. They bypassed strong points, cut supply lines, and encircled defenders. Wherever the Poles tried to stand, the Germans flowed around them like water, sealing entire units in deadly pockets. For the Polish army, the shock was overwhelming. They had mobilized nearly 1 million men, but most were on foot, with horses pulling artillery. Against the thunder of tanks and the swarm of aircraft, their courage was real, but their weapons outdated. One legendary story, Polish cavalry charging German armor, has long been misunderstood. They did not ride with sabers against tanks, but even with rifles and anti-tank weapons, their bravery could not stop the Iron Tide. Warsaw, the capital, became a target from the first day. Bombs reduced neighborhoods to rubble. Trams lay twisted on their tracks. Fires lit the night sky, visible for miles. Families huddled in basements, listening to the roar of engines above, praying the next bomb would fall elsewhere. The strategy of Blitzkrieg was not only about speed, but about shock. It aimed to paralyze the enemy's ability to think, to move, to resist. By hitting everywhere at once, from the air, from the ground, from behind the lines, it created chaos that spread faster than bullets. And in Poland, it worked. Within days, German forces advanced dozens of miles into Polish territory. Communications collapsed. Commanders could not find their units. Entire regiments were surrounded before they even realized they were under attack. But Poland did not surrender quietly. At Westerplatte, a small garrison of just 200 men held out for a week against waves of German attacks, becoming a symbol of resistance. In other towns, soldiers and civilians fought street by street, sometimes with rifles, sometimes with bare hands. They knew they could not win, but they fought because surrender meant annihilation. The German press boasted of swift victories. Newsreels in Berlin showed cheering crowds, convinced their nation's power was unstoppable. But behind the propaganda lay a darker truth. Poland was being ground into dust, and its people were paying the price. Refugee columns clogged the roads, mothers clutching babies, old men dragging carts. They were bombed and strafed as ruthlessly as soldiers. By targeting civilians, the Germans hoped to break Poland's spirit. Instead, it only deepened the nation's suffering. Blitzkrieg was more than a military tactic. It was psychological warfare. It told the world that old rules no longer applied, that treaties, borders, and lives could all be swept away in days. In the first 2 weeks alone, Germany advanced farther than anyone thought possible. Poland was reeling, exhausted, but still fighting. Yet even as its soldiers stood their ground, another threat loomed on the horizon. From the east, the Soviet Union was preparing to strike, and soon, Poland would find itself trapped between two merciless giants. By mid-September, Poland was bleeding, but still fighting. German forces had smashed through its defenses, yet pockets of resistance continued. In Warsaw, citizens dug trenches in the parks, barricaded streets with overturned trams, and filled sandbags to prepare for the siege they knew was coming. Polish soldiers, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Then, on September 17th, a second hammer fell. From the east, Soviet troops poured across the border. Stalin, bound by his secret pact with Hitler, struck a wounded nation from behind. For the Polish people, it was betrayal on a scale almost too great to comprehend. They had prepared to fight Germany. Now they faced annihilation by two giants at once. The Red Army advanced rapidly, its sheer size overwhelming exhausted defenders. Villages that had barely survived German bombing now saw columns of Soviet tanks rolling down their streets. Polish officers, desperate to hold their lines, received orders that resistance was futile. Their government had already fled south toward Romania. The nation was dismembered before their eyes. For civilians, the horror was beyond imagination. Refugees who had fled west to escape the Germans now found themselves caught between two advancing armies. Families wandered aimlessly, not knowing whether the uniform they saw on the horizon meant rescue or death. Some surrendered to the Soviets, believing they might be treated as allies. Instead, many were arrested, deported, or shot. In Warsaw, the siege began in earnest. German artillery pounded the city day and night. Whole neighborhoods crumbled into rubble. Children carried water through shattered streets, dodging falling debris and sniper fire. The population starved, yet still the city resisted, determined to hold on. Even as hope faded, the combined assault was merciless. From the west, the Wehrmacht tightened its grip. From the east, the Red Army carved away what remained. By the end of September, Poland was carved in two, like a carcass on a butcher's table. Warsaw fell on the 27th, its defenders exhausted, its citizens broken. Yet even in defeat, Poland's courage endured. Underground resistance networks began to form, promising that the fight would continue in the shadows. Soldiers who escaped capture made their way to France and Britain, vowing to keep fighting until their homeland was free. But for now, the reality was grim. Poland had been erased from the map, its territory divided between Hitler and Stalin, as casually as two thieves splitting their spoils. The world had watched, a nation crushed in less than a month. And Europe learned a terrifying lesson. The dictators would not stop. They had tasted victory, and nothing, not treaties, not borders, not promises, would stand in their way. The storm had truly begun, and the rest of the continent would soon feel its fury. On September 3rd, 1939, just 2 days after German tanks rolled into Poland, the world held its breath. In London, people crowded around radios, waiting for the voice of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. At 11:15 a.m., his words cut through the static. Britain is now at war with Germany. Moments later, the church bells tolled, echoing through the city like a funeral. The reaction was strangely subdued. There were no parades, no cheering crowds. Instead, there was silence, heavy, fearful silence. Londoners remembered the last war, the millions who never came home, the endless funerals. This was not a call to glory. It was the return of a nightmare. In Paris, the atmosphere was the same. The French government declared war hours after Britain, and sirens wailed across the city. Soldiers marched to their stations, while civilians lined up for rations and gas masks. Many stared at posters urging calm, yet their eyes betrayed dread. Memories of the trenches were still raw. and no one doubted that France would soon be tested again. Yet despite the declarations, little happened on the Western Front. For Poland, under bombardment, the promised help never arrived. French and British armies mobilized, but they did not advance. Instead, they dug in behind the Maginot Line, a vast network of fortifications along the French-German border. It was strong, but it was static. The Germans were moving with speed. The Allies were waiting for a war that looked like 1914. This period became known as the Phony War. For months, soldiers sat in trenches, staring across no man's land at their enemies, with only occasional skirmishes breaking the monotony. The silence on the front was deceptive. For Poles fighting desperately in Warsaw, it was betrayal. They had trusted their allies' promises. But when the time came, the West hesitated. In Britain, the public mood wavered between grim acceptance and uneasy calm. Gas masks were distributed, blackout curtains hung in every home, and children were evacuated to the countryside. People waited for air raids that did not come. Not yet. In France, soldiers smoked and played cards in their bunkers, convinced they were safe behind the Maginot Line. But safety was only an illusion. For Hitler, the lack of Allied action was confirmation of his beliefs. He had gambled that Britain and France lacked the will to strike decisively, and the gamble had paid off. Poland was being carved apart, and the West stood idle. This emboldened him, feeding his confidence for the campaigns to come. Still, the declarations of war mattered. Though Britain and France had failed Poland, they had crossed a line from which there was no return. For the second time in a generation, Europe was engulfed in conflict. Men enlisted, factories shifted to wartime production, and nations braced for battles they knew would come. But in those first weeks, the most striking feature was not the roar of cannons, but the weight of waiting. The world had stepped into war, but it had not yet learned how terrible this war would become. The calm before the storm still lingered, and it would shatter. Only when Hitler turned his gaze westward. By late September 1939, the fate of Poland was sealed. German forces had driven deep into the heart of the country, while Soviet troops closed in from the east. The nation, defiant but overwhelmed, was being carved apart in real time. In Warsaw, the siege reached its brutal climax. For weeks, the capital endured relentless bombardment. German artillery reduced entire districts to rubble. Luftwaffe squadrons dropped incendiaries, turning neighborhoods into infernos. Water supplies ran dry, food vanished, disease spread among the terrified population. Yet Warsaw refused to surrender. Citizens built barricades out of bricks and tram cars. Soldiers defended every street corner, and children carried messages through burning alleys. The city had become a symbol, a beacon of resistance, even as the noose tightened. Elsewhere, smaller garrisons fought with equal determination. At Westerplatte, 200 Polish defenders held out against thousands of Germans for 7 days, refusing repeated calls to surrender. Their resistance stunned even the attackers, proving that courage could defy overwhelming odds. At the Modlin fortress, Polish troops endured constant shelling, holding their ground until September 29th. These battles, though hopeless, etched themselves into the nation's memory as acts of defiance against impossible odds. But courage could not stop collapse. On September 17th, the Red Army's invasion from the east ensured Poland's doom. The Polish High Command, realizing the situation was hopeless, ordered surviving troops to withdraw toward neutral Romania and Hungary, where many would later join Allied armies in exile. The government itself fled, determined to continue the fight abroad. For civilians, there was no escape. Refugee columns stretched for miles. bombed from above by German planes, harassed by Soviet patrols. Entire families trudged along roads littered with wreckage, their future uncertain, their country gone. Some sought safety in villages, only to find themselves occupied by one army in the morning and another by nightfall. To live in Poland in September 1939 was to live in chaos, where no flag meant protection. On September 27, Warsaw, exhausted and starving, finally surrendered. By early October, the last organized Polish units had fallen silent. The campaign had lasted only 5 weeks. Poland was erased from the map, partitioned between Hitler and Stalin, as agreed in their secret pact. Western Poland was annexed into the Reich, its cities renamed, its people subjected to brutal repression. In the East, Soviet occupation began with mass arrests, deportations, and executions of anyone deemed a threat to communist rule. A nation that had fought bravely was dismembered without mercy. The world watched in horror, but also in shock. At the speed of Germany's victory, Blitzkrieg had proven devastatingly effective, crushing a modern nation in mere weeks. Britain and France had declared war, but their inaction left Poland to its fate. The message was clear. No country was safe, and yet, Poland's fall was not the end of its story. Thousands of its soldiers escaped to fight on in France, in Britain, and later in the skies over England during the Battle of Britain. Resistance networks formed in the shadows of occupied towns, keeping the spirit of defiance alive. Though the nation's borders were erased, its will to fight endured. Still, September 1939 remained a tragedy. Poland had become the first victim of World War II, a nation crushed between two merciless giants, sacrificed while the world hesitated. The fall of Poland was both an ending and a beginning. The end of independence for millions and the beginning of a global conflict that would engulf all of humanity. The fall of Poland sent shockwaves far beyond its borders. In just over a month, a nation of 35 million had been erased from the map. The world was watching, and what it saw was terrifying. The world had hoped that the horrors of the First World War would never return. Now, with Poland's destruction, it was clear the age of total war had returned, and it would be worse than before. The phrase whispered in cafes, in parliaments, in barracks, was the same. Poland today, us tomorrow. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated. His gamble had worked. Britain and France had declared war, but had not struck. The Reich had expanded. The pact with Stalin held firm, and the myth of German invincibility grew stronger. For him, the invasion of Poland was only the first step. The rest of Europe would follow. The world had watched Poland fall. The question now was simple and terrifying. Who would be next?